Colorado, Boulder, Estados Unidos. El Timothy, Tim, es profesor de geografía en la Universidad de Colorado, Boulder. Entre 2012 y 2023 fue director del Centro de Estudios Asiáticos de Colorado y entre 2018 y 2023 fue director del proyecto China Made, colectivo internacional de investigación enfocado en el modelo de desarrollo por exportaciones impulsado por infraestructura de China. Ha sido profesor visitante en universidades como la Universidad Nacional de Singapur, la Universidad de Oslo, la Universidad de Hong Kong, la Universidad de Wageningen y la Universidad Minso de Guizhou. Bienvenido, welcome, Timothy. Uh, it's a pleasure to have you here, Flaxo, and the floor is yours. Antes de comenzar, quisiera expresar a las personas que están presentes que el personal de organizador va a identificar quienes tengan preguntas y ustedes escribirán sus preguntas en unos papeles, me imagino, después me las pasarán a mí y yo realizaré las preguntas a Timothy. Eh, thank you, Timothy. Go ahead. Thank you. Ya, podemos poner las slides, por favor, porque vemos ahí, pero no vemos acá. Tal vez es mejor que estén también.
Well, buenos dias, everybody. It's my pleasure to be here. That's the extent of my Spanish, which is just to say that I am not not a Latin America scholar. This is my very first time to Ecuador, to Quito. I want to thank the organizers for inviting me. It's great to be here. And while I don't I'm not an expert on China and Latin America, I have spent a long career working in China since the late 1980s, early 1990s. And I've always been very interested. Most of my research has been very place-based, very grounded. I'm a geographer by training. I spend a lot of time looking at economic development in remote regions of China. And I've always been impressed about how different China looks when you look at it from the perspective of the ground, from small locations rather than high-level international relations or geopolitics or policy analysis or these kinds of things. I don't do that kind of work. I suppose in some ways, as a cultural geographer, my research is more like cultural anthropology. But as China has changed over the years with its remarkable development and modernization, so too has my own perspectives on and work on China. As China has become more global, I've also felt compelled to better understand global China from a grounded, place-based perspective. And the talk I'm going to offer you this morning is just a brief summary of some of the ways that I've tried to think about how we might understand global China from a grounded place-based perspective as a complement to and as a different way of thinking about China from the more, I suppose, more conventional, more typical policy-oriented geopolitics, international relations type perspectives. So I'm going to offer you a little bit of I'll offer some introductory remarks, kind of framing what I want to talk about. I want to talk very briefly about the China Made project that I developed over the past 5-6 years or so. And then I will talk very briefly about some of the theoretical aspects of my approach, but I will only touch on that briefly. It may be a little bit too, I don't know. There's a lot of social theory perspectives in there that I'm only going to brush over very briefly. And I'll give you a few examples of some research projects that I'm working on that kind of try to illustrate some of this approach that I'm going to offer. As you all know, of course, China's expansive engagements beyond its borders over the past decade have resulted in increased scholarly attention to the idea of global China. And there is a broad range of activities inherent in this term: construction, investments, digital technologies, development, finance, various kinds of soft power projects. And a lot of the scholarly community has been tasked with the question of what difference does China make in the global development discourse, in the global development practice? How is China doing things differently? And one of the most popular ways of getting at that question in terms of a framework of analysis has been the Belt and Road Initiative as a kind of a policy framework for kind of thinking about all the different aspects of what China does and what difference it might make in global development. And in some ways, the Belt and Road Initiative, and first of all, apologies to you all for the map. I'm an Asia-focused person, and I realized after I was looking at the slides that it leaves Latin America entirely out of the map. And Latin America, of course, is in many important Belt and Road countries, including Ecuador, part of the Belt and Road. So I apologize for the Asia-centric map, but the Belt and Road has become, in many ways, the stand-in for not only how we understand global China's aspirations, but for its global footprint as well. In other words, there's a lot of work that has been done that uses the Belt and Road Initiative as a framework for analyzing what China actually has been doing on the ground, the impact that China has had in different parts of the world. But if we dig a little deeper into the Belt and Road Initiative and look at how it relates to the actual facts on the ground of what China has been doing, we find that it, and in fact, is quite a problematic analytical framework for understanding global China. It's not to say that the Belt and Road isn't a powerful policy, umbrella policy framework, but it doesn't always match what China's actually doing on the ground. The Belt and Road Initiative, for example, is not the driving force for Chinese investment in Chinese infrastructure investment in Africa. The empirical evidence demonstrates that the BRI has not had any effect on infrastructure investments and investment trends in Africa. In other words, whether or not a country is a Belt and Road country in Africa seems to have no empirical effect on the different levels of Chinese investment. The economic corridors emphasized by the Belt and Road in policy documents and media reports have not had an effect in channeling Chinese infrastructure investment. John Hillman and his team, for example, found no significant relationship between corridor participation and the project activity on the ground. After 10 years, to quote one report, the BRI has not led to any major changes in sectoral or geographical composition of China's overseas development finance program. And it turns out that the top destinations for Chinese investment, the United States, Australia, Brazil, France, and Germany, are not Belt and Road countries, and perhaps the United States is going to be dropping out of that category soon. Not sure. And I bring all this up not to deny the power that China has in shaping global development, but to suggest that we need other ways of understanding that power, or additional ways of understanding that power. A top-down view from 30,000 feet policy framework, policy-oriented approach, in which the Belt and Road Initiative becomes the analytical framework for global China, doesn't work as well as it might. And so my approach has come out of a sense that we need to understand global China from the perspective that is closer to the ground, that is project-based, but that is also global in terms of understanding China's overall approach in comprehensive terms. In this sense, the Belt and Road is viewed less as a policy vehicle and more as a platform for a kind of power that is in fact difficult to contain or control. And this is because infrastructures are inherently localized, grounded in place. Infrastructure projects entail connections across many different sectors, many different stakeholders, many different actors. Most of you, of course, are well aware of this. We might call infrastructure projects sticky in that regards. They are inherently embedded in local contexts, and those contexts then have a way of shaping their outcome. There are a lot of popular images of the way China does development. And one of the most popular images that people have or conceptions is the zone of kind of an exceptional space where China engages in certain kinds of surgical extraction projects that have minimal impact or minimal connection with the societies and economies around them. There's a term in Chinese for that. It's called fei di, literally flying land. Is kind of this idea of the zone that just kind of pops down and extracts something and then moves on. But in fact, this is a misleading way of thinking about how these projects actually interact with and engage with local contexts. And in that respect, we can think of them as sticky. So conceptually and methodologically, this approach can be summed up by the phrase thinking infrastructurally or infrastructural thinking. And this involves foregrounding what Brian Larkin famously refers to as infrastructure's dual ontology. That is, infrastructures are a thing as well as a relationship among things. And this means viewing infrastructures as unstable configurations of both human and non-human actors, human and non-human agencies. And this also involves being attuned to the technopolitical effects of these configurations. That is, in thinking infrastructurally might be thought of as a different way of conceiving of power and of the political. And of thinking of global China as a technopolitical project in terms of infrastructure power. That is, the way China's influence is achieved through the technopolitical effects of infrastructure, the material powers that they have. So this approach is something that we developed in the China Made project, which was funded by the Henry Luce Foundation. It was a collective of international scholars working on ground-based, place-based perspectives, project-based perspectives on China's infrastructural-based model of development. The work we've done is basically completed on the project. The website is still there, and I invite you to look. There's a lot of resources on and published materials and interviews and videos on the work that we did for this. The project was not a focus on global China per se. It was on infrastructure as a means of better understanding China's political economy, on what foregrounding infrastructure might tell us about the Chinese state and about Chinese politics. It was also about taking a project-based rather than policy-based approach to China's activities beyond its borders. But it wasn't until our final workshop that we began to confront the broader field of global China studies in a more direct way. And that's the approach that I'm talking about today, global China as a field of infrastructure power. So this is just some of the objectives and observations that we had with the project. I'm not going to go into a lot of detail on this in the interest of we just don't have that much time. But these are some of the workshops that we had. Unfortunately, the project spanned the coronavirus pandemic, and we weren't able to do as much of the field work as we wanted, but we were still able to bring scholars together either virtually or in person in various ways. And these are just some of the outcomes that we developed out of the project. And you can see the website address there as well. And so just again, many of the ideas that I'm bringing to you today came out of the workshops and the discussions and the conversations that we had in the China Made project. Just a few things to say about theory, about the idea of infrastructure power as an additional or alternative way of thinking about global China. In the simplest terms, infrastructure power describes the capacity of infrastructures themselves to shape and even penetrate social, economic, political, cultural, and/or institutional formations. To the extent that modern states control infrastructural development through investment, regulation, and administrative processes, then they can be said to wield such power. Yet more recently, scholars have also suggested that the myriad social technical relationships generated through infrastructural configurations have their own powers to shape outcomes beyond what the state might intend with those projects. In other words, that's just kind of a fancy way, I suppose, of saying these projects take on a life of their own because of the material nature of their development, because of their contextual situatedness, and so on. So drawing on both of these approaches, we can say that the Chinese state wields infrastructural power domestically and internationally, but that power cannot always be controlled by or contained by the state. So a little bit more on state infrastructure power itself. We can think of two different ways of thinking about that infrastructure power of the Chinese state. One is infrastructure as a byproduct of state power, as an outcome of the way Chinese statecraft and state building occurs in China. And the other is infrastructure itself as a field of power, as a means by which the state wields power through infrastructure. So I'll talk about each of these very briefly. The first, infrastructure as an outcome or byproduct of the Chinese state. In some respects, we can think of the Chinese state as an infrastructure machine. In China, they often refer to it as a jijian kuangmo, an infrastructural maniac, because of its hyper focus on linking GDP growth and development to infrastructural construction. There is a fundamental belief among state actors that infrastructure propels growth and needs to run ahead of demand for it. Since 1949, this belief has also driven China's outbound investment priorities as well. And this makes sense coming from a party of engineers and technocrats. This has led to an apparent result that China's level of infrastructure seems to exceed its level of economic development. And there's various figures and statistics that I could give to illustrate that, but in the interest of time, I'll move on. But the point being, overinvestment in infrastructure is baked into the state system in China due to its structural organization, the fragmented nature of authority in China, the role of the party and the way that it promotes its personnel, and the competitive nature of the policy process among different localities. All of these lead to a fundamental focus on infrastructure construction that really exceeds what you might expect otherwise for even a country with a high level of GDP, such as China. So for example, for every 1% increase in earmarked transfers from the center in economic development is associated with a 5% increase in local spending on infrastructure. So needless to say, this pattern of local government expenditure is unsustainable in China. It has led to a tremendous amount of local debt. And China has built, as a consequence of this overinvestment, a huge infrastructure industry that results in excess capacity and generates incentives for massive infrastructure exports. So global China is in many ways a manifestation of this infrastructural machine. There we go. A manifestation of this infrastructural machine. And even as the Chinese state recognizes the unsustainability of the infrastructure debt finance cycle that has led to this high level of infrastructural development within China, it continues to rely on new infrastructural formations to try to break out of that debt cycle. And so here we get into the more focus on digital infrastructure development that has really become the centerpiece of China's Belt and Road Initiative today. But I'll say a little bit more about that later. The other way of thinking about infrastructure in China, state infrastructure power, is infrastructure as a field of power, fundamental to state territorialization. That is, infrastructures are necessary for turning space into territory. Infrastructures allow the state to penetrate space and secure its power. They also enable the state to penetrate civil society through its command of resources and social goods. So infrastructures are at the heart of Chinese state power, both domestically and its efforts to wield influence abroad. As David Lampton and his colleagues have recently argued, Beijing believes that infrastructure provides the pathways along which power in its coercive, economic, persuasive, and ideational forms move. Infrastructure is the grid to which all forms of power move. It lies at the core of China's future power and welfare. But state control over infrastructure power depends not just on the direct exercise of power, but also on a more governmentalized form of power. And I won't go into a lot of detail about this. But it's not just a form of top-down power, but it also involves kind of bureaucratization and shaping ways that people engage in development and these sorts of things. But in the interest of time, we'll move on. Another important aspect of infrastructure power is how it exists, how infrastructure power can be conceptualized as something that exists beyond the state or outside the state. It's not just a form of power wielded by the state or controlled by the state, but it is a relational form of power that operates through the fact that infrastructures are these systems of technologies, users, standards, materials, and so on. And so again, should be no shock to anyone that large-scale infrastructure projects generate unintended outcomes. But this way of thinking about infrastructure power is a way to kind of theorize those unintended outcomes in a more systematic way. The technopolitical approach that we sought to develop in the project was really about trying to find the political and hidden and unexpected places, that the political outcomes or political effects of these projects were not necessarily just related to the Chinese state's intentions or other state actors, but the infrastructural configurations themselves created political outcomes that might have been unexpected or unintended, but nevertheless ended up having a lot of impact on shaping how those projects came about. So let me just then talk a little bit about how we might view, from a research perspective, global China as a field of infrastructure power. And I'm just going to use a couple different examples. And I'm not, how are we doing on time? 10 minutes? Okay, good. So we should have enough time to get through these. The two areas that I've been focusing on most recently in my own research, I've been doing projects now and Chinese projects in Thailand and in Indonesia. So kind of focusing on Southeast Asia as a region of kind of looking at how China wields or attempts to wield infrastructure power and the effects that it has on the ground. And one of the areas that I've been looking at is through digital technologies, digital infrastructures, and digital services, and then also through urban development and patterns of urbanization that emerge from China's engagement in these places. So we'll talk briefly about each of these. In terms of digital services, you know, Xi Jinping has famously mentioned somewhere along the way that that data is the new oil, and it is one of the most important areas that China has focused in terms of its recent infrastructure investment and development initiatives. The Belt and Road Initiative in many ways emerged out of the coronavirus pandemic, recalibrated as a more digitally focused, smaller scale set of initiatives, rather than the large, hard infrastructure projects that dominated global China prior to the pandemic. We've seen a kind of a shift towards a more digital technology and the whole digital Silk Road approach as a way of kind of rethinking the Belt and Road Initiative. It's smaller scale, greener, perhaps even in some ways more ideologically useful for China to be promoting digital services that are offered as an alternative to those that are the large tech firms that come out of the United States in particular, and the kind of hegemonic role that they have played so far in kind of global digital development. One of the questions that comes along as people start looking at this kind of focus on digital services from China is this question of whether or not, and this particularly among scholars in the United States, perhaps less so in Latin America, but one of the questions you see a lot is whether or not China is exporting a form of digital authoritarianism, and in terms of its digital Silk Road ambitions. And so I'd like to just offer a few thoughts on how we might think infrastructurally about that type of a question. So China builds digital infrastructures China builds digital infrastructures. That's one of the that's what it does. It gets countries online, or that it promotes its digital Silk Road as an infrastructural means to digital development. Creating digital facts on the ground first. It's a very infrastructural approach. Build the digital infrastructure first. And that is to say, much of what China does precedes legal and regulatory frameworks that might be necessary to govern how data is used in different countries, questions about data sovereignty, data exchange. A lot of the time, China builds digital infrastructures in the global south prior to the establishment of any of these kinds of regulatory frameworks. The other thing to consider, of course, is that the Chinese state has its data governance priorities, but this is complicated by the commercial logics of China's tech firms that actually do the digital construction, laying the infrastructural groundwork for digital development. And while there's been some regulatory crackdown on tech firms within China, the state is just one actor in a much broader and more complicated field of digital infrastructure power. The state, of course, the Chinese state promotes a model of data localization and data sovereignty, but tech companies often establish their own data regimes via the actual digital infrastructures that they create in different countries on the ground. So the data governance regime that global China is pushing out there is an infrastructural one, rather than, as I mentioned, a legal or regulatory one. And examples of that might be found in Alibaba's electronic world trade platform and the digital free trade zone that they set up also in Malaysia. So even as the Chinese state supports the digital Silk Road as an aid instrument designed to spur ICT development in the global south, it performs more as a data and revenue accumulation strategy for Chinese tech firms. That is, there's a bit of a disconnect, or maybe not a contradiction, but while the digital Silk Road is promoted as a way of building digital sovereignty for all the countries involved in the digital Silk Road, the presence of Chinese tech firms and the infrastructural means by which they have built out the digital environment in those countries means that China is emerging as a robust agent of platform capitalism more than anything else in this process. And yet digital infrastructure power remains subject to disruptions and appropriations from below, as street level innovators develop all sorts of digital intermediations that build platforms on existing infrastructures to improve people's everyday lives. So at the same time that you have tech firms kind of doing what they do in terms of extracting revenue and data, which might be contradictory to the kind of policy pronouncements of the digital Silk Road, you also have people on the ground using those digital infrastructures often in ways that they had not been initially intended. So you've got a lot of complicated aspects, which taken as a whole, make it very difficult to respond to a simple question like, is China exporting digital authoritarianism? Because from an infrastructural perspective, you would find that, or you could argue that the situation on the ground goes in many different directions from just what a top-down perspective might assume. In terms of urban development, another area that I've been looking at, patterns of urbanization are being generated by global China, and these patterns of urbanization can be thought of as infrastructural in at least two ways. One is that Chinese digital infrastructures are reshaping how urban planning and development occurs in different parts of the world, particularly in places that I've been looking at in Southeast Asia. But another way is that is beyond these digital impacts, urban landscapes are changing significantly as a result of the kinds of infrastructures that China builds on the ground. So we have different ways of approaching planning and also different landscapes of urbanization. So in terms of the first of these, digital infrastructures and how they're reshaping urban planning and development. These might include smart city developments, eco-city and safe city projects are a big part of what China is developing in terms of urban planning. Infrastructures of surveillance and governance, including smart meters for real-time energy monitoring, and artificial intelligence security applications such as biometric security, facial and fingerprint recognition, and these kinds of things. These are a large part of what China exports in terms of urban development and planning. Huawei and ZTE have over 350 smart city projects initiated or planned in more than 60 countries. And Alibaba's City Brain initiative has been implemented in Kuala Lumpur with plans for expansion throughout Asia. The myriad effects of these technological systems are impossible to predict, but will certainly be felt by more and more urban residents, particularly in the global south. In terms of the second changing landscapes, here we go. China's so-called Shekou model of port city development that drove the rapid growth of Shenzhen has, for instance, been viewed by other countries as the key to China's explosive modernization and urbanization, the so-called Shenzhen model. And a lot of countries saying, "Can you build us a Shenzhen?" and a lot of MOUs and a lot of agreements have been built based on this idea of kind of reproducing the Shekou model around the world. But even as new cities scratch the surface, even as new cities built from scratch are often promoted by Chinese real estate investment firms, the infrastructural power of these cities themselves, as they're built on the ground, is building actual landscapes that in many ways decenter the city and blur the conventional boundaries between the rural and the urban. So here, one of the things I've been looking at is while many countries want China to build a kind of a brand new city, much of the logistics and infrastructural basis of the urban development that China promotes is creating very different kinds of landscapes that are not concentrated agglomerations of urbanity, but more infrastructural spaces of circulation, of logistics connections, ports, and these kinds of things that often look very different from what we might expect a new city to look like. And in the Q&A, I can talk more about some examples of that I've been looking at in Southeast Asia. But those are just a couple very brief kind of overview ways of thinking about how infrastructures are reshaping or shaping in some way, unexpected ways, what global, the impact, the effect that China is having around the world. So if we were going to ask the question of, whether or not China is exporting a kind of special economic zone model of enclave urbanism around the world, we would have to answer that the infrastructural basis of that development channels those projects in different ways away from what we might expect a special economic zone to look like. And so just to wrap up then, I want to go back to the idea of stickiness and sticky power, the ways that we can think of infrastructures as place-based sticky configurations, right? The infrastructure-centric nature of global China as a field of power makes it particularly susceptible to the place-based contingencies of the host contexts in which those projects are built, making it very difficult for the Chinese state to kind of dictate the outcomes of those projects. Qingquan Li has famously argued that compared to private capital, Chinese state capital is more sticky and place-bound, meaning that it is more vulnerable to local contingencies since China's investment motives cannot be reduced to simple profit-based calculations alone. The infrastructure power of China's investments accentuates this place-based quality. So infrastructure power describes both the top-down and bottom-up dimensions of the influence of global China. On the one hand, the state and large companies within China, both private and state-owned, wield tremendous power through the projects that China plans, invests, builds, and even fails to build. But on the other hand, these projects have their own material powers or logics that produce a diversity of effects that are often hidden, unanticipated, or even counterproductive to China's long-term strategic interests and goals. So with that, I would like to also just acknowledge the various people who have been involved in the China Made project in various stages. They've all been very crucial to kind of contributing to this set of ideas that, however briefly and in a fragmented way, I've tried to convey to you this morning. So thank you very much.